My son called me from a payphone at the Kelowna airport. Not his cell, a payphone. That detail is the one that told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. Mom. His voice had that particular flatness I recognized from when he was 9 and trying not to cry in front of his father's family at the funeral. Controlled, careful, already breaking underneath. They're gone, he said. She took Nadia and the bags, and I'm standing here with my wallet and my jacket, and that's it. Her father called me into the office this morning and said I was finished. Both things, the job and the marriage. Same meeting. I asked him where he was standing exactly. Gate C. There's a Tim Hortons. Get a coffee, I said. Get something to eat, I'm coming. What I didn't say, what I had been waiting 3 years to say, was that I already knew this day was coming. I had known since the autumn his father-in-law shook my hand at the rehearsal dinner in that particular way. Men shake hands when they've already decided you don't matter. Firm, brief, dismissive. The handshake of a man who has never once looked at the woman in front of him and thought, I should pay attention to this one. I told my assistant to hold everything and got in the car. The drive from West Kelowna to the airport takes about 20 minutes on a good day. It was March, so the roads were the way they always are in March. Not quite winter, not quite anything else. I drove myself. I have a man who handles logistics for me, a quiet Métis fellow named Ray who has worked with me for 11 years and who knows when a situation calls for him and when it calls for me. This called for me. I found my son at a table by the window in the terminal cafe. He had a large coffee in front of him and was staring at the tarmac the way people stare at things when they're not seeing them at all. He is 41 years old, and he looked, in that moment, like a man who had just been told a language he thought he spoke fluently didn't actually exist. He saw me and stood up, and I crossed the room and put my arms around him the way I used to when he was small. He let me. That told me something too. Come home, I said. We'll figure the rest out from there. He nodded against my shoulder. We didn't say much on the drive back. The mountains were doing what they do in March, showing off their indifference to human problems, gray and enormous above the lake. My son watched them out the passenger window, and I let him. That evening, after a proper meal, I made his father's braised short rib recipe, the one he's always liked. He sat at the kitchen table and told me everything. It had started the way these things always start. Small. His father-in-law had brought him into the family business 4 years ago. Stellarbrook Property Holdings, one of the larger private real estate development companies in the Okanagan. My son had done well there. He had a background in civil engineering and a mind for numbers, and he had grown their commercial portfolio by 30% in 3 years. He had done this for them. He had given them that. But his father-in-law had a way of remembering contributions that suited him and forgetting ones that didn't. And somewhere in the past year, my son's contributions had begun to stop suiting him. He told me I'd been misrepresenting project timelines to lenders, my son said. He had both hands wrapped around his mug. He had a binder, printed documents with my name on the cover sheets, reports I apparently submitted that inflated completion projections. He said it constituted lender fraud. I said nothing. I poured myself more tea. He said if I didn't resign quietly, he'd report it to the Financial Services Regulatory Authority. He said my engineering license would be next. He looked at me. He had my wife in the room. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. He waited for me to react. And Nadia? I asked. My granddaughter, 7 years old, gap in her front teeth, obsessed with anything to do with horses. She was already in the car. He'd arranged it. My wife had already packed a bag for her. They planned the whole thing for days at least, and no one told me a word. He pressed his fingers against his eyes. Mom, he said if I disputed anything, if I contacted a lawyer or made any noise, he'd file a formal complaint and I'd never work in BC again. I looked at my son across the table. Outside, the lake was black and still. I had lived beside it for 30 years. I knew every mood it had. Go to sleep, I said. I'll be up for a while. After he went upstairs, I went to my office at the back of the house. It's a small room with a desk and 2 filing cabinets and a window that faces the water. I called Ray at 10:30. I need the full project record for Stellarbrook's last 4 years of commercial development, I said. Every lender submission, every timeline report, every document that has my son's name on it, and every document that should have his name on it but doesn't. And I need the corporate registry filings going back 10 years. Ray said, by when? 48 hours. Done. I hung up and opened a folder on my computer that I had first created 38 months ago, the week my son told me he was going to take the job with his father-in-law's company. I want to be clear about something. I am not, by nature, a suspicious woman. I was married to the same man for 34 years, and I trusted him completely because he had earned it. When he died of a stroke 11 years ago, I took over the management of everything we had built together, and I learned very quickly that the world has a particular way of looking at a woman in her late 50s who has just inherited a significant amount of structural and financial complexity. It looks at her like a problem to be solved, like a resource to be accessed, like someone who might not notice what's happening until it's already happened. I noticed. When my son told me he was going to marry into the Stellarbrook family, I did what I always do. I read everything I could find: corporate filings with BC Registry Services, land title records, financial statements from their development projects, partnership agreements, the kind of paperwork that tells you more about a family than any dinner conversation ever could. What I found was a company that was very good at appearing larger than it was. A reputation built on a handful of landmark projects and a great deal of careful social positioning. His father-in-law was a prominent donor to the Kelowna Symphony and the Regional Hospital Foundation. His name was on a bench at Waterfront Park. He sat on 2 provincial boards. He was also sitting on a ground lease. In 2019, Stellarbrook had acquired the development rights to a significant commercial site in downtown Kelowna, a mixed-use tower project on Bernard Avenue that was intended to be the centerpiece of their portfolio. The deal had been structured as a long-term ground lease from the underlying landowner, a numbered company registered in Alberta that held the freehold title. I had incorporated that Alberta company in 2017. My late husband and I had owned the Bernard Avenue parcel since 2004, when it was a parking lot and nobody thought it was worth anything. We'd held it through 2 recessions and 1 pandemic because we understood something about land near water in the interior of British Columbia, which was that it would always be worth more later than it was now. When Stellarbrook came looking for a ground lease partner in 2019, they found one through a property broker who didn't know the full ownership chain. My father-in-law had negotiated the lease with a holding company representative. He had never asked who was behind the numbered company. He had never looked far enough. He had been building his centerpiece project on my land for 4 years. He did not know my name. I had kept the distance deliberate. When my son married his daughter, I had made a conscious choice to give them space, to watch, to see who these people were when nothing was at stake for them yet. I had hoped I was wrong about the handshake, about the way his mother-in-law spoke to waitstaff, about the particular quality of attention his father-in-law paid to my son when he needed something versus when he didn't. I was not wrong. I closed the folder and stood at the window for a while. The lake was doing nothing in the dark, which is what it does, and I found that steadying. My granddaughter was somewhere with her mother tonight, probably in that enormous house in the Mission neighborhood with the wine cellar and the heated driveway. She was 7 years old, and she had no idea that the adults around her were in the middle of doing what adults do, which is make enormous decisions about things she doesn't yet have words for. I was going to make sure she landed somewhere soft. Ray arrived 2 mornings later with a USB drive and a printed summary. He sat across from my desk and went through it methodically, the way he does everything. The lender submission documents they showed your son, he said, have been altered. The original project timeline reports are on record with 3 of the lenders. The versions in that binder don't match. Page counts are different. 2 of the signature blocks have been moved. And the dates on the cover sheets don't align with the email metadata from the original submissions. He slid a sheet across the desk. The alterations were made from inside the Stellarbrook system. Someone with administrator access, their internal IT contractor, a man named, he checked his notes, who has held the admin credentials for 7 years and who was granted expanded file permissions 8 months ago. Who authorized the expanded permissions? Ray looked at me steadily. His father-in-law, personally. I nodded. What else? The IT contractor has a CRA collections flag. Back taxes, $43,000. Ray paused. He also has a line of credit with Okanagan Business Lending Partners. I looked at him. You acquired OBL Partners in 2021, he said. You hold his debt. I sat with that for a moment. His father-in-law had used a man whose debt I owned to forge documents against my son. Not because he knew he couldn't have known, but because people like him never look far enough down the chain to see who's actually holding things together. I called my lawyer at 9 o'clock. She was at my door by 10 with a yellow legal pad and the particular expression she gets when she knows a file is going to be interesting. Document fraud, she said, writing. Defamation, wrongful dismissal, tortious interference with a professional license. She looked up. Did he contact FSRA? Not yet. He threatened to. Extortion by threat, attempted regulatory abuse. She wrote that down too. What are you thinking? I'm thinking he's receiving an industry award next month, I said. The Okanagan Real Estate Development Council dinner. They're giving him the Legacy Builder Award at the Hotel El Dorado. She set her pen down. You've been invited? The invitation came 3 weeks ago, addressed to my holding company. He's never made the connection. She looked at me for a long moment. What do you want to happen? I want him to receive exactly the legacy he's built, I said, in front of everyone who's ever believed in it. She picked her pen back up. Then we need the recording first. My son sat at the kitchen table 2 days later. My lawyer sat beside him. I stood near the hall where I could see into the living room, where my granddaughter had arrived that afternoon. Her mother had dropped her for the week. Some complicated arrangement that I suspected was her mother's way of beginning to create distance from what was coming, without having to admit she knew it was coming. My granddaughter was sitting on the living room floor building a stable out of wooden blocks for her toy horses. She was completely absorbed in it, narrating quietly to herself. My son answered on the second ring. He put it on speaker. I wanted to check in. His father-in-law's voice was warm in the way of a man who has had many years of practice being warm to people he doesn't respect. I know this has been a hard few days. I want you to understand that nothing that's happened has to be permanent. My son said nothing. What we're asking is very straightforward. A letter, acknowledging that some of the timeline projections in your reports may have been optimistic. You don't need to characterize it any particular way. Just a professional acknowledgement of an honest error in judgment. My son's hands were flat on the table. I didn't make any errors. A pause. I'm being very patient. The warmth dropped by exactly 1 degree. I haven't filed anything with FSRA. I haven't spoken to anyone at the Engineering Association. I've been protecting you, actually, by keeping this internal. Another pause. But if you decide to make this adversarial, I'll have no choice but to let the process run. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a path forward. Sign the letter, accept a negotiated settlement on the separation of assets, and Nadia goes between both households, the way these things are supposed to work. His voice softened slightly. She needs her father in her life. Don't make choices that take you away from her. My son looked at me across the kitchen. I gave him one small nod. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. The call ended. My lawyer stopped the recording and set it on the table. Extortion. Custodial coercion. Custodial coercion. Attempted regulatory fraud. She looked up. We have everything we need. I looked through the hall at my granddaughter who had finished the stable and was now walking her horses through it one by one, introducing them to each other in a very serious voice. The dinner was in 3 weeks. We had work to do. The next 10 days move the way purposeful things move, quietly and in the right direction. I called my contact at Pacific Meridian Bank, a woman I had done business with for 14 years, straightforward and careful in a way I've always respected. I told her I wanted to acquire the full lending exposure of Stellarbrook Property Holdings and its principals. all personal and corporate debt, every outstanding obligation to every institutional creditor. She was quiet for a moment. That's a significant position. I'm aware. We're talking roughly $6.2 million across commercial lines, a personal HELOC on the Mission property, 3 vehicle leases, and a bridge loan they took last spring on the Bernard Avenue project. What's the discount on a same-week clean transfer? 14%, given the size. Call it $5.3 million. Wire it by Thursday noon. She was quiet again. You'll be their sole creditor. That's correct. They won't know until I'm ready for them to. By Thursday evening, every dollar his father-in-law owed to any institution in British Columbia was owed to me. I called Ray and told him to flag the associated accounts for a standard creditor transition security review. His father-in-law's corporate credit cards would start declining by Friday morning. His personal accounts would follow by the weekend. It would read like a banking glitch, the kind of thing that takes days to sort out, days during which a man like that would be increasingly distracted and off balance. The following Monday, I drove into the city. The Bernard Avenue site was a tower of glass and timber frame construction, 22 stories, the kind of building that announces itself from 3 blocks away. They'd done good work on it architecturally. I give them that. The lobby was river stone and Douglas fir, very Okanagan, the kind of design that tells you the developers understood where they were. They hadn't understood who they were dealing with. I met with my property manager at the Ground Lease Administration office and signed the papers initiating the early termination clause, breach of good faith, material misrepresentation by the tenant entity, 180 days notice. In 6 months, they would need to find another foundation for their flagship project, or they could negotiate on my terms. They didn't know yet. They would, soon enough. My son didn't know the full scope of it, not then. That evening he found me in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment. "Mom, what's actually happening?" I looked at him over my tea. He is so much like his father. The same quality of attention, the same way of standing in a doorway when he's working something out. "Something honest," I said. He was quiet. "How long have you been planning this?" "I've been hoping it wouldn't be necessary," I said. "For about 3 years." He came and sat down. Outside, we could hear my granddaughter in the living room, talking to her horses. "The award dinner," he said. "You're going." "I've been invited for 3 years. I've always sent my regrets. This year I won't." He looked at me for a long moment. "What's going to happen?" "He's going to receive his award," I said. "And then the room is going to understand what his foundation is actually built on." He was quiet. "Your daughter is going to be fine," I said. "You're going to be fine. That's what's going to happen." He nodded, not because he understood the full picture, because he trusted me the way he's trusted me since he was 4 years old and decided that whatever I said about something scary was probably accurate. The Hotel El Dorado had done a beautiful job with the room. June in Kelowna, the lake visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the light coming off the water the way it does on long evenings when the sun won't commit to setting. Round tables with white linens, 200 people in their best clothes, the whole of the Okanagan development community assembled to honor a man who had spent 30 years being the right kind of visible. I wore a gray dress I'd had since my husband's retirement party and my mother's earrings, small pearls. I arrived at 7 with my lawyer beside me and took a table near the east wall where I could see the stage clearly without being easily noticed. His father-in-law was at the head table, silver-haired and comfortable, moving through the cocktail hour with the ease of a man who has been comfortable in rooms like this for so long he no longer remembers what it felt like not to be. His wife stood near the windows, speaking to someone I recognized as a city councilor, her posture the particular kind that reads as warmth from a distance and something else up close. They had not seen me. The AV technician was a young man I'd hired the previous week and introduced to the venue staff as a contractor for the evening's digital presentation. He had spent 3 days preparing exactly what I'd given him. He nodded when I arrived. At 8:15, the president of the Development Council approached the podium. "It is my honor," she said, "to recognize a man whose name has been synonymous with quality and integrity in this valley for 3 decades. The applause started before she finished. His father-in-law rose from the head table and walked to the stage with the ease of a man receiving something he believes he has genuinely earned. He shook hands. He accepted the award, a piece of etched crystal that caught the spotlight. He looked out at the room with a settled expression, the expression of a man at the end of a story he has always been writing to end exactly this way. 30 years ago, he began, I stood on a piece of land in this valley with nothing but a set of plans and a belief that what you build reflects who you are. Every project I've undertaken since then has been built on the same foundation: honesty, accountability, a commitment to this community. He paused. The room was attentive. Those aren't just words. They're the structure that holds everything else up. The projection screen behind him, set up for the award presentation slideshow, flickered once. He didn't notice. He was still speaking. It went dark. Then it filled. White text on black, clean and large enough for the back of the room to read without difficulty. The ownership chain of the Bernard Avenue ground lease, each holding company layer listed in sequence, ending on the final line, the Alberta Numbered Company, Incorporated 2017, sole director, my name. The room shifted, a murmur, low and immediate. His father-in-law turned. He looked at the screen. I watched his face move through 3 things in about 4 seconds: confusion, calculation, and then something flatter and more private that I recognized as the expression of a man who understands, suddenly, that something has been true for a long time, without his knowing. The document comparison appeared next. 2 versions of my son's project timeline reports, side by side, the original and the altered, differences highlighted in yellow. Date fields changed, page footers shifted, signature blocks repositioned. Below the comparison, a single line of forensic notation, manipulation confirmed, all instances, authentication by Hillview Document Forensics, Vancouver. Someone at a nearby table said something under their breath. A chair moved. His father-in-law reached for the microphone. There seems to be a technical. His voice was controlled but not quite level. He tapped the microphone. It was working perfectly. The next slide was the IT contractor's file, the OBL partner's line of credit, the CRA collections flag, a timeline of the system access logs showing when the administrator permissions had been expanded and by whose authorization, then the recording. His voice through the ballroom speakers, warm and precise. Sign the letter. Accept a negotiated settlement on the separation of assets, and Nadia goes between both households the way these things are supposed to work. A pause. Don't make choices that take you away from her. The room went very still in the way rooms go still when everyone in them is processing the same information at the same time and no one is sure yet what the correct social response is. His wife's hand went to the table in front of her. I stood. I have walked into difficult rooms for 40 years, boardrooms, courtrooms, the hospital room where I sat with my husband while the doctor told us what we were dealing with, the lawyer's office 11 years ago when I decided that what we'd built was worth continuing. I know how to walk into a room. You go steady and you go present and you don't apologize for being there. People moved aside. The president of the Development Council stepped back from the podium without being asked. I took the microphone. 200 faces turned toward me. I looked at his father-in-law first, then at his wife. My name is Beverly Dunmore Ashby, I said. I am the sole director of Ridgecrest Land Holdings Limited, which is the beneficial owner of the Bernard Avenue freehold. I have been the ground lessor of the Stellarbrook Tower project since 2019. A pause. He did not build on his own foundation. He built on mine. Complete silence. My son gave this company 4 years of his expertise, his reputation, and his professional integrity. In return, his father-in-law fabricated a record of lender fraud, directed his IT contractor to alter and forge project documents in my son's name, and threatened to destroy his engineering license if he did not sign a false confession. I turned to face the room. He also threatened to use my granddaughter's access to her father as a condition of that confession. His father-in-law said something. I don't know what. The room was not listening to him. The recording you just heard is one of 2 documented instances of extortion and custodial coercion, both now in the possession of the RCMP's Economic Crime Unit and the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, who coordinate with BC on cross-provincial fraud matters. I kept my voice even. All of it will be part of the formal record. His wife stepped forward. You have no standing to. As of last Thursday, I said, I hold the entirety of Stellar Brook's outstanding debt, every commercial credit line, every personal loan, every vehicle lease, the HELOC on the Mission property. I looked at her. Every dollar your family owes to any institution now belongs to me. I turned back toward the room. The ground lease on the Bernard Avenue property has been terminated under the bad faith clause, 180 days notice. I paused. The building they have called their legacy, the address on 30 years of letterhead, the project they have described tonight as the foundation of who they are. I let that sit for a moment. It sits on my land, and I am reclaiming it. The doors at the back of the room opened. 2 RCMP officers came in, followed by a woman in a blazer I knew, an investigator with the BC Securities Commission who had been briefed the previous Thursday and had moved quickly once she saw the file. Ray walked beside her with a folder. They crossed the room without rushing. His father-in-law looked at the door. He looked at me. He looked at the screen, which was still displaying the forensic document analysis. The investigator said his name, and then the thing they say in that situation. He looked at the Crystal Award still in his hands, as if he'd forgotten it was there. He set it on the podium. He walked toward the officers. His wife was already moving toward her own counsel, whom I noticed had been sitting 2 tables from the stage. They had prepared for some version of a difficult evening. Not this one. The room was loud for a long time afterward. My lawyer appeared beside me and said something I didn't fully register because I was looking at my phone. My son had texted 4 words. Is it done, Mom? I typed back, come get you daughter. He texted a single question mark. I wrote, she's going home with her dad tonight. The courtroom was the kind of room that takes everything seriously because it's been built to remind you to. High ceilings, tall windows. The particular quality of quiet that only exists in places where decisions with real weight are made. I sat in the 3rd row. My lawyer was to my left. My son was to my right, and he held my hand on the armrest between us. Not tightly, just present, the way adults hold on to each other when they're in the middle of something that matters. My granddaughter was at home with the woman who looks after the house when I'm away. She was fine. She had her horses and a promise of pancakes. The judge entered. We stood. She sat. We sat. She opened the file in front of her and read for a moment before she spoke. His father-in-law received 11 years. Document fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit regulatory fraud, extortion. He was ordered to repay my son's legal fees in full and to surrender all interest in Stellar Brook property holdings. His professional memberships with 2 provincial development councils were revoked. His wife received 9 years. The custodial coercion charge had carried more weight than her legal team had anticipated. She was ordered to pay a direct settlement to my son, and her position on the Regional Hospital Foundation Board was formally vacated. The IT contractor had cooperated with the Crown in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would serve 18 months and had already, I understood, returned to his family in Penticton. When the officers led them out, his father-in-law did not look at anyone. His wife looked at the far wall, at something only she could see. My son exhaled. It was a slow breath, like something being let out after a very long time under pressure. It's done, he said quietly. The legal part, I said. The rest takes longer. 3 months later, I drove into the city on a Tuesday morning. The Bernard Avenue Tower looked the same from the street. It always would to anyone passing. Inside, my property management team was completing the asset transition. Tenant notifications done, new lease administration in place. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. My son was standing in the corner office, the one that had been his father-in-law's, the one with the unobstructed view of the lake and the eastern hills and the long flat light of the Okanagan summer. He had a small team with him, 2 people from his old engineering firm who had agreed to join whatever came next. He turned when I came in. He was wearing a shirt I'd given him for his birthday, a blue one, and he looked like a man who had been somewhere dark for a while and was starting to remember what the light looked like. "The lenders are satisfied," he said. "The project timeline is back on track. 3 months behind because of everything, but the structural work is sound." He held up a folder. "And I've had 3 unsolicited calls from developers in the last 2 weeks. Word travels." "It does," I said. "We're going to call the company Clearwater Engineering and Property," he said. Nadia picked the water part. She said it sounded like somewhere you could swim. I laughed. The first real, unguarded laugh I'd had in months. "She's not wrong," I said. He came to stand beside me at the window. The lake was doing what it does in June, which is be so blue it seems unreasonable, and the hills were the green they only manage for about 6 weeks before the heat turns them gold. "Mom," he said, "how long did you really know?" "About the land, since 2019, I said, "when they signed the lease." "And you just—" He stopped. "You watched them." "I watched them. I hoped I was wrong about the kind of people they were." I looked at the water. I wasn't. He was quiet. "I should have listened to you more," he said finally. 3 years ago, when you had questions about them, you were in love, I said, and you were building something. Those things make you want to believe the best." I looked at him. "That's not a flaw. That's just being human. It cost me. It cost me, Athed. They took time from you. That's real, and it matters. But you're 41 years old, and you have a daughter who adores you, and a company that's about to become something, and the building you're standing in is on my land, which means as long as I'm alive, no one is taking this floor out from under you." He didn't say anything for a moment. His jaw moved slightly the way it does when he's working out what he feels. "Thank you, Mom." I squeezed his arm. Outside, the lake was being unreasonably blue. That evening, I picked up my granddaughter from school. She ran across the pickup area in her purple jacket, with her backpack half hanging off one shoulder, which is how she always wears it, and she climbed into the car and said, "Grammy, my teacher said the Okanagan Lake is one of the longest lakes in BC. Did you know that?" "I did know that," I said. "How long have you known?" "A very long time." She considered this. "I want to swim all the way across it someday." "We'll work up to that," I said. She looked out the window at the lake as we drove along the shore, thinking about something private. "Grammy," she said after a while. Is Dad going to be okay now? For real?" I kept my eyes on the road. The lake was on our left, and the hills were on our right, and the light was doing what Okanagan light does in the late afternoon, which is turn everything a color that doesn't quite have a name. "Your dad is going to be more than okay," I said. "He's going to build something really good." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking out the window. My son was waiting at the house when we pulled in, sitting on the front steps with 2 mugs of tea, one for him and one for me. He'd gotten into the habit of doing that in the evenings. I didn't mind it at all. My granddaughter ran up the steps and through the door without stopping, already telling him something about the lake. I sat down beside him. He gave me the mug. The lake was visible from the steps, the way it's always been visible from this house. A long, flat line of blue between the trees. "Good day," he said. "Good enough," I said. We sat there while the light changed. His father-in-law had looked at my son and seen someone useful, someone whose skills and reputation could be borrowed and then, when it suited him, discarded and destroyed. He had looked at my granddaughter and understood her as a pressure point. He had looked at me, the few times he looked at me at all, and seen a widow in her 60s from the west side of the lake, pleasant enough, not worth much attention. There is a particular kind of man who has spent his whole life deciding at a glance who is worth paying attention to and who isn't, who has turned that assessment into something so automatic he doesn't even notice he's doing it anymore, and he is almost always right, which is why he stops questioning it. He was not right about me. I had been in this valley for 30 years. I had built something here quietly, the way you build anything that lasts. Slowly, without announcing it, without needing anyone else to name it before it was finished. I had bought land when it was nothing. I had held it through every difficult year. I had watched this lake change with every season, and I had not gone anywhere. The mistake people make when they look at a woman like me and decide I'm not worth their attention is that they confuse quietness for absence. They think that because I am not in the room the way they are in the room, loud, visible, taking up the space they believe they're entitled to, I must not be in the room at all. I am always in the room. I am 63 years old, and I am not done building, and neither is my son. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I'm glad. If you know what it is to be underestimated by someone who should have known better, I want you to understand something. That is their failure of imagination, not yours. The ground beneath their certainty belongs to someone. Make sure it belongs to you. Take care of what's yours before anyone thinks to come for it. If you're watching from somewhere in this big, complicated country of ours, drop a comment and tell me where. And tell me, have you ever been the quiet one in the room that someone decided wasn't worth noticing? I'd like to hear about it. I've thought a lot about what actually happened here. Not the legal part, that sorted itself out the way things do when you've done the work of building something solid before anyone comes to take it. I mean the deeper part, why any of it was possible at all. My son is a careful, honest man. He went into that family with his skills and his trust and his best intentions, and he gave them everything he had. And his father-in-law took all of it, the work, the reputation, the years, and treated it like inventory. Something to be used until it wasn't useful anymore, then discarded quietly before it could cause a fuss. That's not bad luck. That's a choice. And choices like that don't stay contained. They spread through everything a person builds, like a crack in a foundation that nobody wants to look at directly. You can put marble over it. You can put your name on a bench at the park. You can accept awards in front of 200 people who believe the story you've told about yourself. But the crack is still there, and eventually, the weight of everything above it becomes too much. What I want to say about my son is this: he didn't fail. He trusted the wrong people, which is a different thing entirely. Trusting people is not a weakness. It's what you do when you're trying to build a life in good faith, and good faith is not something to be ashamed of. The shame belongs to the people who knew he was acting in good faith and used it against him anyway. What saved him was not that he stopped trusting. It's that he had someone in his corner who had been paying attention long before the crisis arrived. That's what I want people to take from this, if they take anything. The work you do quietly, the things you build without announcing them, the attention you pay when no one is asking you to pay it. None of that is wasted. It doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It just feels like being thorough, like being responsible, like doing the thing that needs doing even when no one is watching. But it accumulates. And when something comes for the people you love, it's there. His father-in-law made a calculation. He looked at me, when he looked at me at all, and decided I was a peripheral figure, a widow from the west side of the lake. Pleasant enough, not worth understanding. That calculation cost him 11 years and everything he'd spent 3 decades building. The thing about that kind of dismissal is that it's self-reinforcing. Once you decide someone isn't worth your attention, you stop gathering information about them. You stop asking questions. You stop looking at the ownership chain behind the numbered company. Because why would you? She's nobody. And in that gap between what you assumed and what was actually true, consequences accumulated. My granddaughter Nadia asked me once, sitting beside me on the front steps watching the lake, whether things always work out in the end. She's 7. She's at the age where she still believes the adults around her are going to give her an honest answer. I thought about it for a moment. I told her I didn't think things always work out the way you hope. But I do think that when you build something real, something honest, something made with your own hands over a long time, it tends to hold. And when you're honest with the people who matter to you, and you pay attention, and you don't look away from the difficult things just because looking at them is uncomfortable, that tends to hold too. She seemed satisfied with that. I'm 63 years old. I have buried a husband and raised children and built things from land that used to be parking lots. I am not done, and neither is my son, and neither is my son. And neither in about 30 years will be that little girl and her stable full of toy horses. That's what I know about how this works. I noticed something was off the first time he asked about the mineral rights. Not the house, not the garden, not the lake view. The mineral rights on my back 40. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing the afternoon's teacups, thinking, who asks that on the third visit? I told myself it was curiosity. I told myself my daughter had finally found someone who appreciated practical things, someone grounded. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything, except the part where I trusted my gut when it finally screamed loud enough. My name is Winona, and I am 63 years old, and I live on a property in the Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island that my late husband Abe and I spent 31 years building into something we were proud of. We raised our daughter Cleo here, in the same house where the kitchen windows fog up every October, where the deer eat the hostas no matter what you plant around them, where the wood stove makes a particular sound at 2 in the morning that I've never once found frightening because this land knows me and I know it. Abe died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which sounds brutal and was, but there is also something almost merciful about a clock that short. You don't spend months bargaining. You spend weeks saying everything that matters. We said it all. He went on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, with the rain coming sideways off the straight, and I held his hand until it was cool, and then I sat in that chair for what must have been 2 hours before I called anyone. After Abe, I had the property, which is assessed just under $900,000, and I had the investment portfolio he'd managed carefully for decades. GICs, dividend stocks, some REITs, nothing flashy, just the patient kind of money that grows if you leave it alone. It was enough. It was more than enough. I had no intention of touching most of it. I had a daughter I adored and a life that, while quieter than before, still had shape and texture and meaning. I want to be clear about who I am so you understand that I am not naive. I taught high school English for 27 years. I read people for a living. I have had students try every conceivable manipulation in the book, and I learned early that charm without substance has a particular quality to it, a kind of over-availability, a smile that appears just a half second too quickly. I know what it looks like. I know what it looks like. I know what it feels like in a room, which is why I find it hard, even now, to explain why I missed it for so long with him. Cleo met him through a colleague at the architecture firm where she works in Victoria. She brought him home 8 months after Abe died, which I understood. She was grieving too, and grief makes people reach for warmth wherever they find it. His name is Derek, and he is 41 to Cleo's 34, and when I first met him, he shook my hand with both of his and looked me directly in the eyes and said he had heard so much about me, and the farm, and Abe's legacy here. I noticed he said farm. We've never called it a farm. It's a property, a home, but I let it go. He was attentive to Cleo in the way that reads as devotion when you first see it, and reads as surveillance later, once you've adjusted your eyes. He refilled her wine before she asked. He touched the small of her back when they moved from room to room. He laughed at her jokes a beat longer than was natural. I noticed all of it and filed it under perhaps he's just nervous around me and moved on. The mineral rights question came during his third visit, a Sunday in April. We were walking the back of the property. Cleo had gone inside to take a work call, and he was asking me what I knew about the aquifer that runs under the valley and whether my land touched it. And then almost without pause, he asked whether I'd ever had the mineral rights assessed. I said I wasn't sure what there was to assess. He said you'd be surprised. Sometimes properties like this have significant value beneath the surface that owners don't even know about. I changed the subject to the deer problem. He asked again, differently, the next visit, and the one after. Never quite the same words, always a slightly different angle. Once it was framed as financial planning advice, once as a news item he'd read about Vancouver Island land values. Once as a hypothetical, have you ever thought about what you'd do if someone made you an offer? I said I'd done my thinking and wasn't interested in offers. He smiled and said he admired that. The smile didn't reach his eyes. Cleo got engaged to him in September at a restaurant in Victoria that I know was expensive because she told me afterward, and I made the mental note that he had chosen the venue. Not her. She called me from the parking lot and she was happy. Her voice had that particular quality it gets when she is genuinely happy, which is breathy and a little surprised, as if joy keeps catching her off guard. I told her I was so glad. I meant it. I wanted to mean it without reservation. I started making calls the following week. My first call was to my solicitor, a woman named Pamela, who has handled my affairs for 11 years and does not waste words. I told her I was getting the estate documents in order now that Cleo was engaged, just to be responsible about it. Pamela said that was wise and asked if there was anything specific prompting it. I said I just wanted to know where I stood with the property and the registered accounts and how things would flow if anything happened to me. She walked me through it clearly. The property would go through the estate and was subject to probate. The registered accounts with named beneficiaries would pass outside the estate directly. The non-registered investments would be part of the estate and taxed accordingly. A new spouse, she told me, would have no automatic claim on assets I'd held before any marriage. But complications arise when people are named beneficiaries, when assets are commingled, when certain documents are signed. I asked her what kind of documents I should be careful about. She listed them. I wrote them down. The second call I made was to my doctor, who I've seen for 15 years and who I trust the way you trust someone who has delivered genuinely hard news with genuine care. I had my annual physical in October, and at the end of it, after the routine things were done, I said I wanted to ask her something that might sound strange. She said, "Go ahead." I said, if someone were trying to establish that I was losing my mental capacity, what would they need? What process would they follow? What documentation would be required? She looked at me for a moment. She asked if I had reason to believe someone was doing this. I said I didn't know yet. I said I wanted to be informed, just in case. She told me that any capacity assessment in British Columbia requires a formal process, a registered assessment by a qualified professional, often a physician or psychologist, with significant documentation and the right to contest the outcome. She told me that flagging concerns with my medical team and keeping contemporaneous records of my own lucidity was actually a protective measure. She suggested I write a letter to be kept in my file, dated and witnessed, stating clearly that I was of sound mind and making my own decisions without pressure from any person. I wrote that letter the next morning. Pamela witnessed it. We dated it, had it notarized, and kept a copy with my estate file. Then I waited, because that is the part no one tells you about. You gather your information, you shore up your defenses, you make your calls, and then you wait, because you need to know what you're actually dealing with before you act. What I found out arrived in stages. The first stage was a conversation Cleo mentioned in passing in November, which she brought up the way people mention things when they don't realize they're telling you something alarming. She said Derek had suggested they meet with my financial advisor together as a family to talk about long-term planning. She said it very casually. She said she thought it might be nice to get everyone on the same page. I asked whose idea it had been. She said his, but that she thought it made sense. I said I'd think about it. I did not think it made sense. My financial holdings are not Cleo's business, let alone Derek's. Not yet. Not ever, unless I choose to make them so. The suggestion that my future son-in-law should sit in on a meeting about my assets before any marriage had taken place, before I had made any decision about how to structure anything, that suggestion told me more than any question about mineral rights had. The second stage was what I heard through Cleo, again without her knowing what she was handing me. In December, she mentioned that Derek had been talking to a friend of his, a colleague, she said, someone in the financial services space, about estate optimization strategies for aging parents. She said it with the particular brightness of someone who has been coached to present something gently. She said Derek just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I looked at my daughter's face, and I could see she believed every word of it. I excused myself to use the washroom and stood at the sink for 2 full minutes. The third stage was confirmed not through conversation but through a letter that arrived at my house in January addressed to me from a firm I didn't recognize. It was phrased carefully, almost artfully careful, as an inquiry about whether I had considered a life interest agreement in which I might retain the right to live on my property while transferring title to a named individual or trust. It offered a free consultation. It had no referral name on it, but the postmark was Victoria, and I had never contacted this firm in my life. I took that letter directly to Pamela. She read it twice. She put it down. She said, "Winona, this is a solicitation for what amounts to divesting you of your property while you're still alive." She told me this kind of letter is not randomly sent. Someone had provided them with my name and address and a suggestion that I might be a willing client. I told her I had a theory about who. She said we should document everything. I called Cleo that evening, not to tell her what I knew. Not yet. I called because I needed to hear her voice and because I needed to know whether she was all right, truly all right, or whether something had shifted in her that I hadn't let myself see. We talked for an hour about ordinary things, her project deadlines, a book she was reading, whether I was going to replant the raised beds in the spring. At the end, before she said goodbye, she said, "Mom, I hope you know I'm not going anywhere." It sounded like she was reassuring herself as much as me. I said I knew. I hired a private investigator in February. This is not something I say easily. I'm not someone who moves through the world with suspicion as a default setting, and engaging someone to look into the man my daughter loved felt like a betrayal of something, even though the thing I was protecting was her. The investigator, a retired RCMP officer who now works independently, found the relevant information within 3 weeks. Derek had a previous relationship in Edmonton about 6 years back, a woman in her late 50s, recently widowed, with a paid-off home and savings. They had been together for 14 months. She had added him to one of her financial accounts, apparently at his suggestion, for ease of access during a period when she'd been unwell. When she recovered and the relationship ended, abruptly on his side, a significant portion of that account had been transferred out. She had not pursued legal action. The investigator believed this was because the transfers had been made while she had signing authority on the account, which created a murky legal situation that would have been costly to fight and emotionally devastating to relitigate in a courtroom. I read that report on a Tuesday evening in February with a glass of water and the wood stove going, and I felt two things at once: a cold, clarifying anger and a grief so precise it was almost like relief, because now I knew. I was not inventing a problem. I was not an overprotective mother reading menace into a man who had done nothing. He had done something before and he was trying to do it again, and this time the person he had chosen to do it to was my daughter. I took the report to Pamela the next morning. She contacted a family law colleague for a secondary opinion. We established that I had sufficient documentation, the letter from the unknown firm, my records of his repeated financial questions, the PI's report, to consult with police if I chose to. The investigator also provided the contact information of the woman in Edmonton who, when I called her, answered quietly and said she had wondered if something like this would happen again. She was not surprised to hear from me. She said she wished someone had warned her. I said I was sorry. She said, "Just take care of your daughter." The wedding was planned for the third Saturday in May on my property, because Cleo had always imagined being married here, and I was not going to take that from her before I had to. There were 42 guests. I hiss, "Hide in here." I liked and ordered flowers from a local farm, and I had spent 3 weeks pretending everything was exactly as it appeared to be, which is the hardest performance I have ever given. The night before the wedding, Cleo came and found me on the back porch just after 10. She sat down beside me with a wool blanket over her shoulders, and we looked out at the property together in the dark. She said, "Mom, is there something you need to tell me?" I looked at her. She said, "I'm not blind. I've seen you watching him differently. I've seen you watching him differently. I've seen you getting quieter. I know you." I told her there was something I needed to show her. I told her we should go inside. I put the PI's report on the kitchen table. I put the letter from the firm beside it. I told her about the woman in Edmonton. I told her about every conversation I documented, every question Derek had asked, every angle of approach. I talked for a long time. I kept my voice steady because I needed her to hear the words rather than the emotion underneath them. Cleo didn't say anything for several minutes after I finished. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her I'd been gathering information since October. She said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said because I needed to be certain. I said because I knew that if I told her too early without proof, it would have looked like a mother who couldn't let go. I said I needed to be someone she could believe, not just someone who loved her. She was quiet for another long time. Then she picked up the PI's report and read it again, more slowly. At the end, she folded it and put it down and said, "What do I do?" I told her that was entirely her decision. I told her she didn't have to make it tonight, and she didn't have to make it to please me. I told her that whatever she decided, I would be standing beside her. She slept in her old room that night. I don't know if she slept at all. The wedding was supposed to start at 2 in the afternoon. At 11:30 in the morning, Cleo came downstairs in her robe and found me in the kitchen and said, "I'm going to call it off, but I want to do it privately, before the guests arrive, just him and me." I asked if she wanted me there. She said yes. I stood in the sitting room while she called Derek and asked him to come to the house early. He arrived at 12:15, relaxed, carrying a garment bag, already in good spirits, and when he saw my face, he recalibrated visibly. Not afraid, not yet, just recalculating, the way a person does when a familiar landscape shifts slightly. Cleo told him she knew. She put the report on the coffee table. She told him about the woman in Edmonton. She told him she had spoken with the firm that had sent the letter. She was very calm. I have never been more proud of her than I was in those 12 minutes. He tried several approaches. First confusion, then hurt, then a version of an explanation involving the Edmonton situation being more complicated than it looked. When none of those worked, he tried to appeal to me directly. He looked at me and said this was a misunderstanding and he hoped I knew that. And he said it with a particular kind of smoothness that confirmed everything. I said I knew exactly what it was. He left without the garment bag. He took his car and he left, and we listened to the sound of the gravel drive until it was quiet again. Cleo sat down on the sofa. She had her hands in her lap. After a moment, she said, "I need to call 42 people." I said I would help. We called them together, sitting side by side at the kitchen table, and I made tea. And somewhere in the middle of the fourth call, Cleo started crying quietly in a way that was nothing like the crying I'd feared. It wasn't the crying of someone losing something precious. It was the crying of someone who has been held under water and has just broken the surface. She cried and made phone calls and drank her tea, and I sat next to her and kept refilling the cup. The caterer came at 1 and we sent them away. The florist's delivery sat in buckets of water on the back porch for 2 days before I brought the arrangements inside. The property was very quiet that afternoon. The deer came and ate the hostas again. That was 8 months ago. Cleo is living in her condo in Victoria, and she is, slowly and genuinely, all right. She's been seeing a therapist, which was her idea, and she talks about it with the matter-of-factness of someone who has decided to take her own interior life seriously. She came for Thanksgiving and we cooked together for 2 days and didn't talk about Derek at all, and it was the best Thanksgiving I've had in 4 years. The woman from Edmonton sent me a card in August. It said, "Thank you." I have it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, next to the photograph of Abe and the small clay pot Cleo made in grade 4 that has no practical purpose and which I have never once considered throwing away. I don't know what Derek is doing now. I don't think about it much. I did what I needed to do, and what I needed to do was protect this land and this life and my daughter. Not from love, because you can't protect someone from love, but from someone who understood exactly how love works and had decided to use that understanding as a tool. Abe always said that a property is only as valuable as the people who know why it matters. He said that about 3 months before he died, standing at the back fence in the early morning, and at the time I thought he was talking about the land. I understand now that he was talking about us. He usually was. People ask me sometimes if I regret not saying something sooner. If I wish I had sat Cleo down in October, the moment I started making calls, and laid everything out in front of her before it had a chance to go further. I understand why they ask. I've asked myself the same thing, more than once. Usually late at night when the wood stove has gone quiet and there's nothing to listen to but my own thinking. But here's what I've come to believe, and I believe it not because it makes me feel better about my choices, but because I think it's actually true. The timing mattered. Not because I needed more time to protect myself. The documents, the solicitor, the letter to my file, those were done early. The timing mattered because Cleo needed to be the one who chose. If I had gone to her in October with half a suspicion and no proof, I would have been asking her to abandon someone she loved on my instinct alone, and she would have had to spend the rest of her life wondering if I'd been right, or just a mother who couldn't let go. I needed to give her something she could hold in her own hands and make her own decision from. That's not patience for patience's sake. That's respect. Those are different things, and I think it's worth knowing the difference. What Derek did and what the man in Edmonton had done before Derek had a name in my mind is a particular kind of cruelty because it works through warmth. It wears the shape of devotion. He refilled her wine. He touched her back when they moved through a room. He laughed at her jokes. All of that was real enough to feel like love, which is exactly why it worked for as long as it did, and exactly why it required more than my word to dismantle it. You cannot argue someone out of a feeling. You can only show them what is underneath it and trust them to see clearly. I think about the woman from Edmonton sometimes. She didn't pursue legal action, and I understand why, because the cost of relitigating something that intimate in a courtroom is its own kind of damage. But she answered the phone when I called. She said what she needed to say. She sent a card in August. That quiet persistence, the willingness to still show up even after being hurt badly enough to make you want to disappear, I find that genuinely courageous. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just not going silent when silence would be easier. What I want anyone to take from this, if they're sitting with something that doesn't feel right, a question asked once too many times, a suggestion framed just a little too carefully, an attention that feels like it's measuring rather than seeing you, is this: your discomfort is information. It is not rudeness. It is not paranoia. It is not an overprotective instinct you should apologize for. I spent 31 years teaching teenagers to read carefully, and the most important thing I ever taught them was that when a text makes you uncomfortable, that feeling is worth examining before you explain it away. The same is true in life. Sit with the discomfort. Ask what it knows. Abe used to say that the land doesn't lie. You can dress it up or deed it away or let it go fallow, but what it is doesn't change. I think the same is true of people. If you watch long enough and stay honest about what you're seeing. Derek could not sustain the performance indefinitely. He never could have. The questions kept coming back because the need underneath them never went away. And that need, left unexamined, would have cost Cleo something she cannot get back. She's all right. We're all right. The hostas are gone again, but I'd stopped fighting that particular battle, and I find there's something almost restful in it. She was sitting on a bench outside the Rideau Center, and I almost walked past her. It was the suitcase that stopped me. 2 of them, standing upright on the pavement beside her, and a little girl asleep across her lap, with her coat pulled up to her chin. My daughter. My granddaughter. On a bench in downtown Ottawa on a Tuesday afternoon in February, when the temperature had dropped to -17 and the wind off the Rideau River was cutting through everything, I stood there for a moment, just looking. She hadn't seen me yet. She was staring at the ground, her hands folded in her lap, very still, not crying. That was the thing that frightened me most. My daughter had always cried easily at commercials, at sad songs on the radio, at stories about strangers. The fact that she was not crying now told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been sitting there and how far past crying she had gone. I walked toward her. She looked up. Something moved across her face, relief and shame at the same time, the way a child looks when they've been lost and finally found, embarrassed that they needed finding. I sat down beside her. I did not ask what happened. I put my arm around her, and I looked at my granddaughter sleeping, and I said, "When did you last eat?" She said, "This morning." I said, "Then let's start there." I had been in Toronto for 3 days, visiting my sister, who had just had a hip replacement and needed someone to manage her medication schedule and make sure she was eating properly. I was supposed to drive back to Kingston the next morning. Instead, I called my sister's home support worker, arranged for extra hours, loaded my daughter's suitcases into the back of my Subaru, buckled my granddaughter into the car seat. I still kept in the back. I had always kept it there, though my daughter had told me more than once it was unnecessary, and I drove them to the best hotel I could find near the Rito Center because it was warm and clean and I could pay for it, and because my daughter needed one night of not being afraid. Over room service and tea, while my granddaughter watched cartoons on the hotel television, my daughter told me everything. Her name is Margaret. She was 34 years old and she had been married for 7 years to a man whose family owned a mid-sized commercial property management company based in Kingston. The company managed office buildings and retail spaces across eastern Ontario, Brockville, Belleville, Napanee, a few properties in Ottawa. Her father-in-law, who had started the company 40 years ago, still ran it with the kind of grip that left marks. Her husband was the operations director. My daughter had worked there as their office manager and accounts coordinator for the past 5 years, because her husband had suggested it and she had wanted to be helpful, and because she had believed, genuinely, that she was part of the family. She told me that 2 weeks earlier, her father-in-law had called her into his office and told her that her employment was being terminated, effective immediately. When she asked why, he told her the company was restructuring. When she pushed further, he said something she had not repeated to anyone until that night, sitting across from me in a hotel room in Toronto with the sound of her daughter's cartoons in the background. He said that he had never felt she was the right fit, that the family had a certain way of doing things, a certain standard they maintained, and that she had always been, in his words, a different sort. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. My daughter had understood exactly what he meant, and so did I when she told me, and I sat with that understanding quietly, the way you sit with something very heavy when you know you'll need all your strength for what comes next. 3 days after she was let go from the company, her husband told her he wanted a separation. He said they had grown apart. He said it calmly, on a Sunday morning, while their daughter was at her grandmother's house, his mother's house, and he had clearly rehearsed it. My daughter asked if there was someone else. He said that wasn't the point. She asked where she was supposed to go. He said she could stay in the house until she found somewhere. Then his father called that evening and told her the house she had been living in for 6 years was in fact a company asset. It had always been held in the company's name as a property management demonstration property, and she would need to vacate within 30 days. She had not called me. I need to explain why, because it is important, and because it was the thing that broke my heart the most about all of it. She had not called me because her husband had spent 7 years, very gradually and very quietly, making her feel that relying on her own family was a kind of weakness. He had never said it outright. He had said things like, "Your mother worries too much, and you don't need to tell her everything, and let's handle this ourselves." He had said it so many times, in so many small ways, that my daughter had stopped reaching for the phone without even noticing she had stopped. By the time she needed me most, she had spent so long being told she didn't need me that she had almost believed it. She had been staying at a friend's apartment for a week, but the friend had a small place and a new baby, and my daughter hadn't wanted to be a burden. She had been looking for work and for an apartment simultaneously, and the rental market in Kingston was brutal, first and last month's rent up front, credit checks, references, and she had no pay stubs from the past month because she had been let go without a proper record of employment. She had her personal savings, not much, because they had always run their household through a joint account that her husband now had sole access to, and she had her daughter, who was 4 years old, and asked every morning when they were going home. That was when she had come to Toronto to look at a job posting. The job hadn't materialized. She had spent her last comfortable night at a friend's, and then that morning, not knowing what else to do, she had sat down on a bench with her suitcases and her sleeping daughter, and she had not called me. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not say what I was thinking, which was considerable. When she finished, I poured more tea, and I said, "All right. I need you to understand something. You are not starting over. You are not rebuilding. You have not lost anything that matters. You have just been returned to yourself, and I am going to help you remember who that is." She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was small and had fallen off her bike that moment before the tears. When a child decides whether the fall was catastrophic or survivable. I said, "Get some sleep, we have work to do tomorrow." What my daughter did not know what her husband and his father had clearly not known either, and this was their most significant error, was what I had been doing for the past 35 years. I had been a registered nurse for 12 years before I transitioned into healthcare administration. I spent the next 2 decades working my way through progressively senior roles in Ontario's healthcare system, eventually spending the last 8 years of my career as the Chief Operating Officer of a regional health authority with an annual operating budget of $240 million. I had managed collective agreements, capital projects, board governance, and regulatory compliance across 4 hospital sites. I had negotiated with provincial ministries and presented to legislative committees. I had managed crises that made my daughter's situation, in terms of complexity, look straightforward. I had retired 18 months earlier, comfortably, with a pension, investments, and a network built over 3 decades that extended into every professional sector in Eastern Ontario. Her husband and his father had looked at me and seen a retired nurse from Kingston who drove a Subaru and brought butter tarts to Christmas dinner. They had made a decision about what I was capable of based on what they chose to see. That was their mistake. The next morning, I made 3 calls before my daughter woke up. The first was to a family lawyer I knew through a former board colleague, one of the best family law practices in Ottawa, with a specialist in matrimonial asset division and a reputation for being exceptionally thorough. I explained the situation. She told me to bring my daughter in that afternoon. The second call was to an employment lawyer. My daughter had worked for that company for 5 years. She had not been provided with a proper record of employment. She had not received severance commensurate with her length of service, which under the Ontario Employment Standards Act she was entitled to. She had in fact received nothing but a verbal termination and a cardboard box for her desk belongings. That was not legal. That was not even close to legal. The third call was to a forensic accountant I had worked with during an audit process at the health authority, a precise, methodical woman who had once found a $112,000 discrepancy in a capital project that 3 other accountants had missed. I told her I had a situation that might interest her. She said she had time next week. I said I'd need her sooner than that. My daughter came downstairs to find me at the desk with my reading glasses on and my notepad out, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I said, "There's coffee. We have a 1 o'clock appointment." She said, "What kind of appointment?" I said, "The kind where we start finding out exactly what was done to you and what it's going to cost them." The family lawyer was excellent. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, and then explained what she believed we were dealing with. The matrimonial home question was complicated by the company ownership structure, but not impossibly, so there was significant case law on the question of whether a property functions as a matrimonial home, regardless of who holds the title, and the fact that my daughter had lived there for 6 years, raised her child there, and had made financial contributions through joint household management would be relevant. She was not without rights. She was, in fact, in a considerably stronger position than her husband and his father had apparently assumed. The employment claim was more straightforward. 5 years of service entitled her to a minimum of 5 weeks' pay in lieu of notice under the Employment Standards Act. And given the circumstances of termination, including the absence of a proper ROE, the failure to provide written notice, and what appeared to be pretextual reasons for dismissal, there was a credible case for additional damages. My daughter had kept her work emails. She had kept records of her performance reviews, which had been consistently positive. She had, without realizing it, documented her own employment history with the kind of care that now made an employment lawyer lean forward in her chair. We filed the employment claim within the week. It was the forensic accountant who changed everything. My daughter, during her 5 years as accounts coordinator, had seen things she hadn't understood, payments to vendors she didn't recognize, invoices for services that didn't seem to correspond to any properties she managed files for, expense reimbursements that seemed, to her, unusually large and unusually frequent for a company the size of theirs. She had noticed. She had even mentioned it once to her husband, who had told her she was misreading the filing system and that it wasn't her area. She had let it go because she had been trained, very carefully, to let things go. She hadn't deleted her work files before she left. They had given her a cardboard box and escorted her out, and in the confusion she still had access to the shared drive for 11 days before anyone thought to revoke her credentials. She hadn't done anything with that access. She hadn't even logged in, but she knew what she had seen. The forensic accountant knew what to do with that information. What she found, working with the documentation my daughter had retained and the employment records obtained through the legal process, was a pattern. Payments to a numbered company in New Brunswick for maintenance and landscaping services on properties that were, in several cases, vacant lots. Fuel and vehicle expense claims at a volume inconsistent with the company's fleet size and documented travel requirements. A series of payments categorized as consulting fees that did not correspond to any contracts in the company's disclosed vendor registry. In total, across the 3-year period that fell within the accessible records, the irregularities amounted to somewhere between $300,000 and $450,000. The range reflected the fact that some of it was genuinely ambiguous. It was possible, the accountant noted carefully, that some of this had legitimate explanations that simply weren't documented. It was also possible that what we were looking at was systematic fraud against the company's own minority shareholders because the company was not wholly owned by my daughter's father-in-law. It had 3 other investors, 2 of whom had no idea any of this was happening. The minority shareholders, it turned out, were very interested to hear from us. I need to say something here about what I felt during this period, because people sometimes assume that when a woman of a certain age moves through a situation like this calmly, she must not be feeling very much. That was not true. I felt a great deal. I felt a fury so complete and so cold that it surprised even me, not the hot anger of the moment, but the slow, solid anger that comes from understanding fully what was done and why and to whom. My daughter had been chosen, I believed, partly because they had looked at her and seen someone without powerful connections, without resources, without a mother who would know what to do. They had been wrong about all 3. I also felt something that was harder to name, a kind of grief for the years she had spent inside that marriage, slowly becoming smaller, for the phone calls she hadn't made, for the version of herself she had left in pieces on the floor of that house in Kingston. I did not let myself stay in that feeling for long. There was too much work. The employment matter settled 8 weeks after we filed. The company's lawyer, once presented with the full documentation, recommended settlement rather than tribunal. My daughter received a sum that covered 18 months of her previous salary, plus an additional payment acknowledging the circumstances of her termination. She received a clean record of employment and a letter of reference. She was not asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement, because her lawyer had specifically advised against it, and because my daughter, for the first time in a long time, held a position of strength and knew it. The matrimonial division was slower, as these things always are, but it resolved. The house was assessed, and my daughter's contributions were acknowledged. She did not get the house, she didn't want it, but she received a financial settlement that, combined with the employment payment, gave her a foundation, a real one. The shareholder situation was something she was not a party to and did not need to be. That was between the investors and their lawyers, and eventually the appropriate regulatory bodies. I will only say that by the time that process concluded, the company that had fired my daughter and taken her home and told her she was not the right sort was considerably diminished, and the man who had told her that her family had a certain standard she didn't meet was spending a great deal of his time with his own lawyers, focused entirely on his own problems. My granddaughter asks me sometimes why Grandma knows so many people. I tell her that when you spend a long time doing your work carefully and treating people well, you build something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet but is worth more than most things that do. She is 4, and she does not fully understand this yet. She will. My daughter lives in Ottawa now. She found an apartment in Centertown, 2 bedrooms, a good school within walking distance. She went back to school herself part-time, online, working toward a certificate in project management, because it turns out that 5 years of running the administrative operations of a property company gave her skills that translate very cleanly into other sectors. She is precise and organized and capable of managing complexity under pressure, and any employer who looks at her carefully will see that. Some already have. We have dinner together on video call every Sunday. My granddaughter tells me about school, about her friends, about what she is drawing and building and making. She has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a very useful combination. There is one more thing I want to say, and it is the thing I most want you to hear if you are watching this, because something in the title sounded familiar. If you recognize something in this story, the slow shrinking, the phone calls you stopped making, the feeling that you were in a house that had never fully let you in, I want you to know that what happened to my daughter is not unusual. It does not require a particular background or a particular kind of family. The people who do this are not distinguished by where they come from, or what they look like, or how much money they have. They are distinguished by what they look for. They look for warmth and trust and a willingness to adapt. They find people who want to make things work, and they use that wanting. What they do not expect is the mother. They never account for the mother. My daughter called me, finally, from a bench outside the Rideau Center, in -17-degree weather, with her daughter asleep on her lap. She had waited too long and she knew it, and I could see the apology already forming when I sat down beside her. I didn't let her give it. She had called. That was enough. That was everything. And from the moment she called, I knew exactly what to do. I told my daughter I was on my way before she even finished the sentence. The drive from Oakville to Pearson took 34 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, not out of impatience, but because I needed something to hold on to. Numbers. Concrete things. The way the 401 opens up past the Dixie exit, the familiar hum of my old Volvo doing exactly what it was built to do. She was standing outside Terminal 1 with 2 bags and my grandson on her hip. He was asleep, head resting against her shoulder, completely unbothered by the fact that his mother's world had just been dismantled around him. Children have that grace, I think. They trust that someone will catch them. My daughter did not look like she trusted anything. I got out of the car. I didn't say a word. I just took the bags, put them in the trunk, and opened the back door so she could get her son settled into the car seat I'd thought to bring. She buckled him in with the careful mechanical movements of someone running on nothing. Then she got in the front, and I pulled away from the curb before the airport security officer could wave me along. We were on the highway before she spoke. "She fired me, Mum." I nodded. She said I didn't belong there, that I never fit, that the family had tried to make it work, but I was. She stopped. She looked out the window at the gray November sky. She used the word unsuitable, like I was a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor. I kept my eyes on the road, and Theo agreed with her. There it was, my son-in-law's name, dropped into the car like a stone into still water. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. I had suspected for months that he had been the one whispering in his mother's ear, giving her the ammunition she needed, framing my daughter as the problem so that his own weakness would never have to be named. "Did he say that to your face?" I asked. He wasn't even there. A short, hollow laugh. He let his mother do it. He sent a text afterward, said he thought it was for the best. I said nothing. I let the silence do its work. Outside, the first flurries of the season drifted across the windshield. What my daughter didn't know, what I had not told her, because there had never been a right moment, and then suddenly there was every reason to wait, was that I had been quietly preparing for exactly this. Not because I had predicted the cruelty, but because I had learned a long time ago that people who build themselves up by diminishing others always, eventually, overreach. And Theo's mother, Lorna Ashworth, had been overreaching for years. My daughter had met Theo at a conference in Montreal 6 years ago. He was charming in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be charming. All surface warmth, quick smile, the kind of confidence that looks like kindness until you've known them long enough to understand the difference. She was 31 and brilliant and had just been made the youngest project lead at her engineering firm. She called me from the hotel lobby after their first dinner, and even then, hearing her voice, I felt something I couldn't quite name, not dislike, something quieter, a small, careful alertness. I met Lorna Ashworth for the first time at an engagement dinner at the family's home in Forest Hill. The house was beautiful, I will say that, old money and good taste, and the particular kind of quiet that comes with a certain kind of wealth in this country. Understated, self-assured, Canadian, in the way that certain Toronto families are Canadian. Which is to say, they trace their influence back far enough that they have stopped needing to announce it. Lorna greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a compliment about my blouse that had just enough of an edge to it that I knew exactly what I was dealing with. "Theo has told us so much about your family," she said. And the way she said your family told me everything, I smiled back. I ate the dinner. I watched. My daughter worked for the Ashworth Group for 4 years. Lorna had offered her the position shortly after the wedding, framing it as generosity, as welcome, as proof that the family was embracing her. And perhaps my daughter had believed that. She was not naive, but she was optimistic in the way that people who have been loved well tend to be optimistic. She believed in good intentions. She believed that effort was rewarded. She learned otherwise slowly, the way you learn most painful things. At first, it was small, being left off invitation lists for internal meetings, being introduced to clients as Theo's wife rather than by her title, having her proposals credited to her team in write-ups that somehow never mentioned her name. Lorna would apologize whenever my daughter raised it. Oversight. We'll do better. And then it would happen again. Then the reorganization came. Lorna restructured the company's project division and gave Theo a new role that required, she said, a cleaner separation between professional and personal. She brought my daughter into her office on a Tuesday morning and handed her a severance agreement. 12 weeks. Non-disclosure clause. A reference letter that was technically positive and said nothing. My daughter signed it because she was exhausted, because she had a 4-year-old, because Theo had told her the night before that it was probably for the best, that the dynamics had become complicated, that they needed a fresh start. She called me from the parking garage. She couldn't even get herself to go back upstairs for her things. A colleague brought them down in a box. I listened. I told her I loved her. I told her to go home, hug her son, and that I would figure out the rest. And I meant it. What Lorna Ashworth did not know, what Theo did not know, because my daughter had never thought to mention it, because it had never seemed relevant, was that I had spent 31 years as a commercial real estate lawyer before I retired. Not a small firm practitioner. I had spent the last 18 years of my career as a senior partner at a firm that handled some of the largest land transactions in southern Ontario. I had negotiated deals involving hundreds of millions of dollars. I had written clauses that protected my clients from exactly the kind of maneuvering that Lorna Ashworth had spent years perfecting. When I retired, I had kept one asset that I had never discussed publicly, a parcel of land. It was a property I had acquired through a trust during a complex estate matter in the 90s. A piece of commercial land on the east side of the city that had been tied up in a family dispute for nearly a decade before I helped resolve it. My fee, in part, had been a stake in the property. Over the years, I had bought out the other stakeholders quietly. I had never developed it. I had never advertised it. I had simply held it the way you hold something you're not sure about yet, waiting to understand what it wants to become. 3 years ago, the Ashworth Group had acquired a long-term lease on that land. They had built a facility on it, a distribution hub, part of a logistics expansion they had announced with considerable fanfare at a press event Lorna had attended in a cream-colored blazer, smiling for photographs beside her son. They had done their due diligence on the corporate trust that held the land. What they had not done, or what their lawyer had failed to flag, which amounts to the same thing, was look closely enough at who controlled that trust. I did. I had never had reason to act on this. I had watched. I had renewed the lease on standard terms. I had been, as far as anyone at the Ashworth Group was concerned, an unremarkable institutional landlord. Then my daughter called me from a parking garage with nothing in her hands but her phone. I called my former colleague Hugh the next morning. Hugh was meticulous and careful and had an absolute gift for the kind of quiet, procedural precision that makes corporate lawyers genuinely frightening when they need to be. I told him what had happened. I was quiet for a moment. "When does the lease come up for renewal?" he asked. 8 months, I said. "Are they in expansion talks?" "They announced a second phase at the investor briefing last spring." Another pause. I could hear him thinking. "Do not renew," he said. "And don't tell them yet. I want to say something about those 8 months, because they matter. I did not spend them angry. I spent them watching my daughter rebuild. She was slower than she used to be, more careful, the way a person moves after they've been hurt, in a way they didn't see coming. She found a contract position through a former colleague, something that kept her busy and reminded her that her skills were real in hers. She started taking my grandson to skating lessons on Saturday mornings, and I would go with her and sit in the cold arena with a terrible coffee and watch him fall down and get up again with the absolute unself-consciousness of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to be embarrassed. She filed for separation in February. Theo's response was to hire an aggressive family lawyer and attempt to have the separation agreement weighted in his favor on the basis of his income versus hers. Her lawyer, a woman I had quietly recommended, one of the best family law practitioners in Hamilton, handled it methodically. Every overreach was documented, every pressure tactic was noted. It took 4 months, but the agreement my daughter walked away with was fair, not generous. Fair, which was all she had ever wanted. Through all of it, I said nothing about the lease. I said nothing when Lorna was quoted in a business publication talking about the Ashworth Group's growth trajectory. I said nothing when the expansion plans were formally announced. I said nothing when Theo posted something on LinkedIn about the company's vision, a post that was full of the kind of corporate language that sounds meaningful and says nothing. I waited. In June, Hugh sent the formal notice of non-renewal to the Ashworth Group's legal team. Standard procedure. The lease would not be extended when it expired in October. The property would be reclaimed by the trust. He told me their lawyer called him within 48 hours. Hugh was politely non-committal. He referred them back to the terms of the lease, which were explicit. There were no grounds for dispute. I knew Lorna would find out it was me eventually. That was not the point. The point was the sequence. The point was that she would understand, when she did find out, that the ground had been shifting under her for a long time before she felt it move. The Ashworth Group's annual gala was held in mid-September at a hotel in downtown Toronto. I had not been invited, of course, but a former client of mine, a woman named Patricia Jane Voss, who sat on 3 different corporate boards and had the kind of long memory that powerful women tend to develop, happened to be attending. She called me that afternoon. Lorna Ashworth has been telling people the lease situation is being resolved, she said. She seems to believe there's been a misunderstanding. There hasn't, I said. I know, said Patricia Jane. I pulled the registry this morning. I've known it was your trust for years, actually. I always wondered when you'd do something with it. A pause. Will you be coming tonight? I thought about it. I think I might, I said. Patricia Jane laughed. It was the laugh of a woman who has watched a chess match develop across a very long board. I'll have them put a seat at my table. I wore the navy dress I'd bought for my youngest grandchild's christening. Nothing dramatic. I did my hair the way I always do. I drove myself. The ballroom was full by the time I arrived. The Ashworth Group's branding was everywhere. Banners, centerpieces, the quiet, pervasive presence of money performing itself for an audience that already had plenty of its own. I found Patricia Jane's table and sat down and ordered a sparkling water and watched the room. I saw Lorna before she saw me. She was working the room the way she always worked. Rooms, deliberate and gracious and watchful, the kind of hospitality that is really a form of surveillance. She had a new blazer, still cream-colored. I noticed she laughed a little too long at something, a man in a gray suit said, the laugh of someone who is managing an undercurrent of worry and doing it professionally. Then her eyes found me. She stopped, just for a moment, just long enough for the expression to shift. Confusion first, then recognition, then something I can only describe as recalibration. She came to the table about 20 minutes later. Patricia Jane had excused herself with impeccable timing. It was just the 2 of us, which I believe was what Lorna intended. I didn't know you'd be here tonight, she said. Patricia Jane was kind enough to invite me, I said. It's a lovely event. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She was very controlled, I'll give her that. She had the composure of someone who has spent decades in rooms where composure is currency. I think there may have been some confusion, she said, about the lease arrangement. My legal team, there's no confusion, I said. She paused. The timing is quite difficult for us. We've made significant investments in that location. A transition of this kind without reasonable notice. You received 6 months' notice, I said. The lease terms were always clear. Another pause. She was looking at me with a particular expression, the one people use when they are trying to understand how a situation they believed they controlled has become something else entirely. I wasn't aware, she said carefully, that you had any involvement in that property. No, I agreed. You weren't. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. Not for me. I had been in boardrooms and courtrooms and mediation tables for 3 decades. I knew how to occupy silence. My daughter, I said, worked for your company for 4 years. She was good at her job. Whatever you may think of her place in your family, she was genuinely good at her job. You know that. Lorna said nothing. She signed a non-disclosure agreement, so she hasn't said a word about any of this publicly, and she won't. That's not who she is. I picked up my glass. I, however, signed nothing. I watched her understand. I'm not interested in the public dispute, I said. I'm not interested in damaging the company beyond what is already in motion. What I am interested in is making sure you understand something clearly. I set the glass down. When you decided my daughter was unsuitable, you made a calculation. You calculated that she had nothing behind her, that she came from nothing and had no recourse and would simply disappear when you were done with her. I looked at her steadily. You were wrong about that. Lorna opened her mouth, closed it. The property will be handled according to the lease terms, I said. My lawyer will be in touch with yours about the transition timeline. I've been quite reasonable in the terms I'm prepared to offer for the winding down period because I'm not a cruel person. But I won't be pressured, and I won't be negotiated down from a position that is legally airtight. Hugh Mercer is very thorough. You may have already discovered that. She had. I could see it in her face. I stood. I smoothed my dress. I looked at her one more time. Not with satisfaction, exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something closer to the feeling you get when you have held something carefully for a very long time and finally set it down. Take care of yourself, Lorna, I said. I went and found Patricia Jane at the bar, and we had a glass of wine and talked about her grandchildren for half an hour, and then I drove home. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. Theo called me? Not Lorna. Theo himself. 3 days after the gala, he called my personal number, which meant Lorna had given it to him, which meant she had told him everything. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. We met for coffee at a Tim Hortons near my house, which I chose deliberately because I wanted him somewhere ordinary and unheroic. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days understanding something about himself that he had been avoiding for a long time. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stared at the table and said, I should have stood up for her. I know that. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was easier, that my mother would come around, that the situation would settle. He looked up. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then the right moment was gone. The right moment, I said, was every moment. He nodded. He didn't argue. I told him that my daughter was doing well, that she was building something for herself, and that she was a remarkable woman, and that his son was going to grow up knowing exactly what kind of person his mother is, which was more than Theo could say for himself right now, but was not, I believed, permanently more than he could say for himself. If he chose differently, he cried a little. I let him. I didn't reach across the table. I just waited. What do I do? He asked. You show up, I said. Not for her. She doesn't need that from you anymore. You show up for your son. Consistently. Without drama. Without making it about yourself. You show up and you keep showing up and you earn the right to be someone he's proud of. I picked up my coffee. It won't be fast. He nodded again. And you sort things out with your mother, I said. That's not my concern. But whatever she taught you about what people are worth, you unlearn it. For your son's sake. He left before I finished my coffee. I sat there for a while after, watching the parking lot, watching people come in from the cold with their collars up, the ordinary Tuesday morning of a life going on around the edges of everything that had happened. My daughter doesn't know all the details of what happened at the gala. She knows about the lease. I told her that much because she had a right to know, and because I didn't want her finding out through someone else. She cried, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, sitting at my kitchen table with her tea going cold, in the particular way that people cry when something heavy they've been carrying finally has a name. "You held on to that land for 30 years, she said. "I held on to it because I wasn't sure what it was for yet," I said. "Now I know." She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Then she wiped her face and picked up her tea and looked at me with the expression she has had since she was small, the one that means she is deciding something. "I'm okay, you know," she said. "I was going to be okay before any of this." "I know," I said. That was never in question. What I didn't say, what I have thought about many times since, is that the point was never whether she would survive it. I knew she would survive it. She is her mother's daughter, and I have survived things she doesn't even know about yet, and I will tell her some of them someday when the time is right. The point was that no one gets to simply decide that someone is nothing and walk away without consequence. Not on my watch. Not my daughter. The December that year was cold but bright, the kind of Canadian winter that is all hard, clear light and frozen ground and the smell of wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. My grandson learned to skate a little, finally, just barely, just enough to get across the ice without falling more than twice. He was so proud of himself. He kept looking back at the boards to make sure we were watching. We were always watching. That is the thing about mothers. We see everything. We keep our records carefully, and we wait, with patience that has been mistaken for passivity by people who should have known better, for exactly the right moment to act. It starts with the word unsuitable, a parking garage, a box of belongings carried down by someone else, a text message that says for the best, a slow, careful decision by someone in a cream-colored blazer that another person simply does not matter, and it ends, sometimes, with a woman in a navy dress sitting down at a table at a gala and saying, very quietly, "You were wrong about that." That's enough. That's always been enough. I've thought a lot about what made Lorna so certain she could do what she did. It wasn't cruelty exactly. Or not only that, it was the assumption underneath the cruelty, the belief that she already knew the full shape of the situation, that she had looked at my daughter, looked at me, looked at whatever she imagined our lives to be, and concluded that there was nothing we could do, that the architecture of her family's wealth and reputation was simply too solid for us to touch. She had made a calculation. She had decided we were negligible, and that calculation was what undid her in the end. Not my land, not the lease, not Hugh's letters or the gala or any of it. The thing that undid Lorna Ashworth was the decision she had made years before any of this, the decision to stop looking carefully at the people she was dismissing. That's what I want to say, if I'm being honest. Not about revenge, about seeing. My daughter saw. She saw what her marriage was becoming long before she admitted it to herself. She saw the pattern in the meetings she wasn't invited to, the introductions that left out her title, the slow, patient erasure of her professional identity dressed up as family loyalty. She saw it and she stayed, for reasons that made sense to her at the time. Love, hope, a child, the very human belief that if she just worked hard enough, the situation would right itself. I don't fault her for that. I stayed in situations I should have left, once or twice for exactly the same reasons. That's not weakness. That's what it looks like to take people seriously, to give them the benefit of a doubt they haven't earned yet. But there's a difference between patience and passivity. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Patience is what I did with that land. I held it for decades because I didn't yet know what it was for. I didn't know if it would ever be for anything. I just knew that holding it carefully, watching it, understanding it, was the right thing to do. That land never made me angry. It never demanded anything of me. It simply waited to be useful. And when the moment came, it was. Passivity would have been signing over the lease when they asked me to, smoothing things over, being accommodating in the way that women of my generation were taught to be accommodating. The way that gets praised is graciousness and is actually just the quiet surrendering of ground that belonged to you. I was not raised to surrender ground. What I hope my daughter takes from all of this, and I think she does, because she is sharper than I was at her age, and she has already shown me who she is becoming, is that integrity is not just a moral position, it's a practical one. You keep your records, you do your work, you build things that are genuinely yours, and you hold them carefully, and you do not let anyone's assessment of your worth talk you out of knowing what you know. That's it. That's the whole of it, Theo cried at that Tim Hortons table. And I let him, and I meant what I said about showing up for his son. I believe people can change when the cost of not changing becomes real to them. I'm not certain he will, but I gave him the honest version of what that would require, and what he does with it is his own. As for Lorna, I don't know what she told herself afterward. I don't need to know. What I know is that she underestimated my daughter because she underestimated me, and she underestimated me because she never thought to look. Look carefully at the people you dismiss. That's the only lesson I have. It is not a small one.